Under the intense heat of studio lights and the silence that settles before a camera rolls, something unexpected happened during the filming of The Chosen's Passover sequence. Multiple cast members began to cry before any line was spoken. There was no dramatic cue, no emotional dialogue, just presence and then tears. What causes a seasoned actor to break into genuine emotion during a scene they've rehearsed dozens of times? And could it be that the most profound performances aren't performances at all, but sacred encounters in disguise? The answer begins with spiritual preparation. Jonathan Rumi, who portrays Jesus, entered the Passover scene not merely as a performer, but as a man who had prepared spiritually for something far greater than acting. With a personal spiritual director by his side and a community of people praying over him, he recognized that this moment, this scene, held something that transcended storytelling. This was not just another biblical reenactment, it was, as he put it, the recreation of the new covenant's birth. If you enjoy content that helps you grow spiritually, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel and join our community for more inspiration. Let's get started. The Last Supper, commemorated across centuries, was not just a final meal. It was a threshold, the bridge between the old and the new. And on that set, something echoed that ancient weight. Jonathan wasn't pretending to be Jesus. He was, as he described, asking God to allow him to feel what Jesus felt in that very moment. There was no method acting that could reach that kind of depth. It was prayer, surrender, and faith. As the cameras began rolling, the mood on set shifted. Rumi's demeanor changed, not with theatrical exaggeration, but with reverent silence. Other actors noticed it. Their own expressions grew heavier. Around the table, the atmosphere became dense with something unspoken. It wasn't direction. It was something felt. Dallas Jenkins, the show's creator, stood behind the monitor and hesitated to call cut. Not because the take wasn't good, but because something sacred was unfolding. Rumi later described being dehydrated by the end of the day, not from heat or effort, but from the emotional and spiritual toll of entering so deeply into that moment. No one could have predicted it. No script could have demanded it. But on that set, as the scene of the Last Supper came to life, the air itself felt different. And everyone in the room knew they weren't just filming a story, they were standing inside one. By the time the actors took their places around the table, something had already shifted in the room. It wasn't tension. It was reverence. The production team had arranged everything with precision. The lighting, the angles, the set details, mimicking a first-century Passover setting. But what none of them could orchestrate was the emotional unraveling that followed. We all encounter moments when the weight of life feels unshakable and clarity seems just out of reach. In times like these, the right insight can illuminate everything. This is exactly what The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions offers, a path to clarity and peace through his revelations. This ebook goes into his prophecies and offers insight into what lies ahead. It's available for free in the pinned comment. Grab it now before the edition's gone. Jonathan Rumi remained silent in the moments before the scene began, his eyes closed, hands resting on the table. Not as an actor preparing, but as someone grounding himself for a moment too sacred to mimic. His breath slowed. Across from him, Elizabeth Tabish, Mary Magdalene, kept her gaze downward, as if even eye contact could disrupt the fragile atmosphere. No one spoke unless necessary. The silence between takes was not awkward. It was necessary. Holy, even. As the camera captured the breaking of the bread, something moved through the cast. A weight none of them could quite describe settled over the room. Some had been skeptical walking into this day. Several crew members weren't religious. and others had grown up around these stories without truly connecting to them. But now, without a word of preaching, they felt their throats tighten. A grip on the soul, not the script. Between takes, makeup artists rushed in to fix tears, real ones. Actors had cried through dialogue they knew by heart. George Xanthus, who played John, later said that as Jonathan raised the bread, it stopped feeling like a scene altogether. For a moment, it felt like he was witnessing something eternal. Noah James, playing Andrew, described it as a strange blend of sorrow and peace washing over him, catching him off guard. Off-camera, the director, Dallas Jenkins, sat behind the monitor. He tried to stay focused, check the framing, monitor audio, but he admitted later he found himself frozen. He couldn't say cut at times because the moment felt too alive, too vulnerable to interrupt. What began as a production task had turned into spiritual participation. Some crew members quietly left the room between takes to breathe, to pray, or simply to be alone with whatever they were feeling. No one rehearsed this. The script was printed, yes, but what unfolded that day wasn't on paper. It was something breathed into the space, something that made even seasoned professionals forget the difference between performance and encounter. They sat in silence at a long table constructed to replicate an ancient Passover setting. But before a single frame was filmed, Rabbi Jason Sobel arrived, not as an advisor, but as a guide. He didn't come with script revisions or historical critiques. He came with intention and with bread. One by one, the cast gathered, not in costume but in quiet anticipation, to participate in a traditional Seder meal, not perform it. Each element was explained in detail. The bitter herbs, the dipping of parsley into salt water, the 4 cups of wine, the reclining posture that symbolized freedom. These weren't props now, they were real symbols, and each actor had to understand them not just intellectually, but emotionally. Jonathan Rumi listened intently, his eyes following Rabbi Jason's hands, mirroring the motions. They weren't practicing for a scene. They were stepping into a rhythm thousands of years old. As they broke the matzo, the room fell silent. No one was prompted to feel anything, but the tears came anyway. Paras Patel, who plays Matthew, later admitted that as he dipped his finger into the wine and recited the Hebrew blessings, something unexplainable stirred. He wasn't raised with these traditions, and yet, in that moment, he felt part of a lineage stretching all the way back to Egypt. If this moment speaks to you in ways you didn't expect, don't forget, a free ebook is available right now in the first pinned comment. Just a handful of copies remain. The symbolic blood on the doorposts that saved Israelite homes during the 10th plague echoed loudly in the minds of the cast. Paras made the connection without prompting. Jesus, arms stretched wide, blood dripping from his brow and wrists, the very image of the Lamb's sacrifice. It was the same shape, the same mercy. That realization hit him hard. For George Xanthus, the moment that struck most wasn't the formality of ritual, but the simplicity of washing hands before the meal. As he poured water over his fingers, he said it felt like preparing for something sacred, like entering a temple. The mundane had become mystical. These weren't rehearsals. This was immersion. What began as a study session to ensure the scene's accuracy had transformed into a deeply personal, spiritual initiation. The cast didn't just learn how Passover worked, they felt its heartbeat. By the time filming resumed, they no longer needed to imagine what the disciples had experienced. They had tasted it themselves: salt, wine, silence, and wonder. The shoot began before sunrise. Cameras were positioned, lights adjusted, microphones checked. But by mid-morning, the crew had already paused 3 times, not for technical issues, but because cast members needed to step away, some to breathe, others to cry. No one had anticipated how raw it would feel to perform the words, "This is my body, This is my blood." Elizabeth Tabish barely got through her first take. As Mary Magdalene, she'd prepared emotionally for what the Last Supper represented. But nothing readied her for the moment Jonathan broke the bread. She later admitted it felt like watching a goodbye from someone who knew exactly what was coming. Her lines blurred in her mind, not because she forgot them, but because she couldn't separate herself from the moment. Off camera, a production assistant wiped her eyes discreetly, startled by the wave of emotion that came without warning. She wasn't a believer. She wasn't even sure why she'd been crying. But something had pressed down on the atmosphere of the room, something that silenced even those who hadn't grown up with Scripture. Noah James, portraying Andrew, said that by the third day of filming, none of them were acting anymore. Every look across the table carried more than character interaction. It was layered with unspoken grief, brotherhood, and awe. The cast members clutched their cups not as props, but with trembling hands. They had become witnesses rather than performers. In one particularly quiet moment between takes, George Xanthus turned to the actor beside him and said, "I don't think we're going to come out of this scene the same." His voice cracked as he said it, not for effect, but because he meant it. It didn't feel like work anymore, it felt like worship. Laughter occasionally bubbled up. Nervous, grateful, human, they held each other between takes, some in silence, some praying together, others simply sitting with closed eyes. There were no directives for this kind of behavior. It emerged naturally, like a communal response to something unseen, but deeply felt. One of the assistant directors later shared she had never seen a set fall this quiet without being called to silence. Even the lighting crew, focused on technical tasks, found themselves moved. When the scene wrapped for the day, no one clapped. They simply sat there, quiet, altered, and unsure how to explain what had just passed through them. Let this serve as a gentle nudge. There's a completely free ebook waiting for you below. A few copies are still left. Grab yours before it's gone. Before the dust of the Last Supper scenes had settled, the crew shifted into staging Jerusalem. The call sheet read simply, "Triumphal entry, 600 extras, crowd scenes begin at dawn." But no line of text could have predicted what Jonathan Rumi would feel as he stepped onto the path laid out for Jesus' arrival. It began with sound. Hundreds of voices rehearsed, Hosanna to the Son of David, scattered at first, then layered into a thunderous echo that bounced off stone and scaffold. Rumi stood just out of view, listening, not as an actor awaiting his cue, but as a man suddenly overwhelmed by history folding in on itself. In retrospect, he said that he felt something greater break inside him, not fear or nerves, reverence breaking through muscle and memory. As he walked forward, surrounded by branches and garments on the ground, the roar of the crowd hit him full force. It wasn't choreographed celebration, it was prophetic reenactment. Faces in the crowd weren't acting joyful. Many were crying. Some raised their hands instinctively. A few dropped to their knees, and no one told them to do that. George Xanthus recalled turning to one of the extras and seeing tears running down her face, even though she had no lines, no close-up. She'd only been told to cheer. "It didn't feel like fiction," she whispered afterward. "It felt like something ancient was waking up." Camera operators struggled to stay focused as the energy surged through the crowd. People weren't just playing townsfolk. They were welcoming someone they had begun to believe in, even if only for a few minutes. Between takes, many of them didn't break character. They lingered, watching, praying, smiling through tears. A few asked if they could stay longer, even if their scenes were done. Jonathan, upon dismounting the donkey, stood in silence for several seconds. He didn't speak to the crew. He looked out over the crowd as if trying to process a weight he hadn't expected to carry. Later, he described that moment as the closest he's ever come to understanding the loneliness and glory of Jesus' final days. It wasn't planned, it wasn't rehearsed. But that day, the city of David breathed again. The final day of filming the Passover sequence had barely ended when Jonathan Rumi checked his schedule and realized what was next: the National Eucharistic Congress. He had committed to it a year earlier, never imagining it would fall just days after reliving Christ's final hours on camera. For a moment, he considered cancelling. He rarely left set during production, but something urged him to go. It didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like timing laced with purpose. He arrived at the event still carrying the spiritual residue of the Last Supper scenes. When he took the stage to speak about the Eucharist, he wasn't drawing from theology books. He had just lived inside the symbols. He had broken bread with trembling hands, heard Hosanna echo across desert wind, felt grief rise in his chest when the wine touched his lips. His voice didn't need polish. It carried the weight of someone who had walked where remembrance becomes real. And for those drawn to quiet moments like this, there's a free ebook offered below. Still available, though only for a little while longer. What struck the audience wasn't his performance, but his stillness. Rumi spoke slowly, not from hesitation, but from reverence. One attendee described it as watching someone return from somewhere sacred. He didn't dramatize anything, he simply testified. About silence on set that felt like prayer. About co-stars who cried when no one was watching. About scenes that refused to stay confined to their schedule. Backstage, a priest approached him and said, "You're not just playing Christ anymore, you're carrying him." Rumi didn't respond right away. He later said he didn't know how to explain that. For the first time in his career, acting and discipleship had blurred beyond recognition. In one quiet moment during the conference, he opened his Bible and reread the words, "Do this in remembrance of me." It wasn't academic, it wasn't metaphorical. For him, it now held texture, the bitter herbs, the weight of the cup, the ache in his knees during long hours of filming. If these insights resonate with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your super thanks support helps us create more content like this. Join our community and stay connected. He returned to the set, changed. Not louder, not more confident, but steadier. The kind of steadiness that doesn't come from performance, but from having tasted something holy. As production resumed, crew members noticed it. Scenes moved faster. Dialogue rang clearer. But most of all, there was calm, an invisible thread running through everything. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew something had happened, and no one would leave the same.